follow Stephen's talk, and I think it's somewhat appropriate, is Roger Parisious, who will talk on Figures in a Dance, W.B. Yeats and the Waite Rider Tarot. Now, this is a completely original topic. Some time ago, Roger came to me with some of his ideas and said, "You know all about Waite. Is this right?" And to my dismay, he had seen things I had never even dreamed of. And he's right. They are there. It's not imagination. He's actually worked in an area I had somehow overlooked. And I'm sure this indicates the fact that in many areas of research within the Golden Dawn, there are many things that have not been looked at. The paper we just heard indicates that to begin with. But I won't try to preempt anything Roger says. I'll tell you something about him. He is the archivist for Anne Yeats, and thus he's very familiar with all the original Yeats manuscripts. He's also General Secretary of the Theosophical Society of Ireland, which is very much a non-adyar body, and therefore it is rational. And he is also, as a consequence, familiar with the whole range of Western and Eastern esoteric thought. So he has the background from which all this has been brought up. At the same time, as the ideas are both original and important, and as I would stress, this is the first time they have been brought out in public, it is fair to state that they are going to be published in due course in book form. And the ideas are copyrighted, insofar as one can copyright an idea in the way they are presented. As this is being recorded, so it constitutes a copyright anyway. I would say this because one has to do it purely for legal reasons. Anyway, without more ado, I'll introduce Roger Parisious.
The first thing I'd like to ask, I assume everyone here knows the Waite Rider Tarot. How many here know the work of W.B. Yeats? A fairly good number. So, nevertheless, some explications may be necessary on that side. I'm going to make two major claims today, and as Bob has indicated, I think both have very far-reaching implications which cannot be touched on in the next 20 to 25 minutes. And frankly, all of these depend on very elaborate proofs that have meant chasing annotated copies in the Yeats house to Wynne Westcott's star charts, back to people who knew Pamela Coleman Smith in 1907 or 8. It has been an elaborate quest on which I began many years ago, thinking it would take about 6 months back in 1968, as I was going to do a quick MA at that time. Well, I never filed that MA because when I wanted it done right. I'll thereupon make two claims. One, which has been ignored by everyone, quite reasonably, as the article has never been republished, is Waite's review of his own work in December 1909 on the publication of his two books on tarot, one of which has been completely ignored by all critics. One, of course, is The Pictorial Key to the Tarot, which, by the way, again can be divided into two. The Key to the Tarot is not the same as the Pictorial Key to the Tarot. Absolutely major alterations have been made in the method of divination. Furthermore, a series of over 800 words have been added with specific reference to the pictorial designs. In fact, if the two copies had been read simultaneously, many confusions that have been going for the last 70-some years would never have been begun. At the same time, Waite published a third book, The Manual of Cartomancy, under the pseudonym Grand Orient. He acknowledged authorship in a letter published in 1933 by his American bibliographer. No one else except myself took any notice of this until Leslie Shepard republished the books in 1971 with a preface. However, Mr. Shepard took the book at face value. The fact is, the book is a key. There were three deliberate publications made. Following the three publications, the Manual for Cartomancy, The Key to the Tarot, and the Pictorial Key to the Tarot, and the article, The Tarot, A Wheel of Fortune, published in Occult Review for December 1909, a fifth book was brought out, the Book of Destiny, which has never been republished from 1912. All of these books are part of a common scheme. In fact, nearly everything that Waite wrote between 1903 and 1915 is coded, a code which has been failed to be perceived by any of his critics, either pro or con, and I am speaking advisedly. Every word. This thing is more charged than Finnegan's Wake or Alice in Wonderland. In fact, either pales by comparison. Waite did not have one secret. He had numerous secrets he was concealing. One of them, of course, was his co-author. He very graciously thanks Miss Pamela Coleman Smith in the December 1909 article, and another who was versed and who was a third collaborator on the pack. The collaboration is never mentioned at any other point in Waite's life, at least not ostensibly. It will be my claim today that the co-author of the Tarot Pack and also the co-creator of the most influential piece of iconography in the last 400 years, and also the greatest literary hoax since Thomas Thorpe decided to append Shakespeare's name to Edward de Vere's sonnets, was none other than W.B. Yeats. Yeats, in fact, gave more than metaphors to, not only was he taking metaphors for poetry from the spirits, he gave metaphors to both T.S. Eliot and Charles Williams, both of whom accepted them without knowing that Yeats was the actual creator of the pack. There, in fact, were two parallel firms going. By the way, this is already a large claim in and of itself. The secondary claim I'm going to make with this, and of course the more important from the viewpoint of the people here today, is that the pack is something rather different than it has been supposed to have been. Number one, it is an ars memoria. The tarot is literally a great wheel, which is why Waite called his article, The Tarot, a Wheel of Fortune. And in fact, he even puts in a note in the pictorial key to thank Grand Orient, the author of Emmanuel Cartomacy, who happens to be himself, and says if he understands the author's intentions correctly, he rather thinks that the Wheel of Fortune might be the most appropriate name for the entire pack. Why? Because it can be arranged as a circular diagram which rotates. In the Manual of Cartomacy, he publishes a great wheel of Pythagoras, and he follows with a series of further wheels and squares. Each one of these contains further mathematical and linguistic qualifications of what he has done the first time around. Let's start with literally the most elementary method. After all, Waite says in so many words that he does not wish to he finds the permutations of the Hebrew letters cumbersome. And after all, this is an elementary handbook. He means exactly what he says. It deals with the four elements, fire, earth, air, and water, each one attributed to one letter. This is a very simple handbook. You're using 5 basic letters of the divine name, Yod, He, Vav, He, and of course Shin, which if you'll notice carefully is being worn by a number of the characters in addition to the Fool. However, look a little more deeply into your pack. More specifically yet, these 4 suits of the tarot, or specifically, the book was not written alone. It was written in addition to the series of publications specifically on tarot with a very large book called The Hidden Church of the Holy Grail, which concludes with a long section on the Hallows of the tarot as being the 4 Hallows of the Grail Castle. This appears in all historical probability to be correct. In fact, Waite and Yeats had numerous historical sources for this, which they did not choose to give out. However, they can be located and they are available. And in fact, this should be emphasized that these Hallows are found in the lower arcana, not in the greater arcana. But the entire 650-page book of the Hidden Church of the Holy Grail is not about the King Arthur legend at all. It's about the tarot pack as a reinterpretation of the Arthurian legend. I'll give you the key right now. And Waite is saying, in fact, he goes through the adventures of Parzival. Parzival is, of course, the Fool. wearing his red feather. At a certain point in the story, Percival kills a red knight and puts on his costume. He is, of course, the Knight of Wands. And in case so we don't miss it, Waite inserts the remark in his second edition, his motion is a clue to the precipitate character of its writer. A precipitate character is, of course, a character on the edge of a precipice. And what is his clue? The horse, if you look closely, has his legs crossed in the form of a swastika. He is doing a dance. Take it further. So we are told in so many words that the Knight of Swords as if he were Galahad. It's not if he were Galahad, he is Galahad. Carrying it further, the Knight of Pentacles is Sir Gawain. Waite makes a great fuss about the fact of how lowly and obscure and corrupt Gawain is. As a matter of fact, he's the Knight of Pentacles, and we'll have something else. In fact, he even gets his pentagram inverted at one point, as Waite knew very well from the story about Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. And number 4, of course, there's Sir Lancelot, who comes in as the Knight of Cups. We can keep this going. Guinevere is, of course, the Queen of Wands. Arthur's reverser, and she's unfaithful. Waite has all these lines about King Arthur's faithless queen. However, we'll go and take it back, of course. By the way, the line about the dismemberment of the Arthurian Empire, of course, Arthur is the emperor. And when Merlin, of course, is the magician. One can go on absolutely indefinitely. The entire pack is coded to the 600-page tarot book. Let's take it a little further than this. Waite persistently tells us that the Grail was moving about, that the castle was here today and gone tomorrow. He means exactly what he said. When he says the authors were poles apart, he means exactly that. He's got them on his wheel, and they are literally poles apart, like from north to south, moving from east to west. After a while, given certain clue keys, you reverse the motion. All right, next one, around. Let's go back to the pictorial key to the tarot. One of these little tricks on which he has literally stood everybody on their head for the last 70-some years, and I'm afraid no clairvoyant sense ever warned them about this one. When he says reverse, he does not mean inverse. He draws a very clear distinction in his definition of the 15th card, the Devil, who has the 2 points up above and the 1 point pointed downward. He twice says it's reversed and once that it is inverse. Reverse refers to the motion of the pack. The cards are a kaleidoscope. Taken on one level, they are a 3-dimensional turning sphere. When he says the secrets belong to the sphere of prudence, which is a most occult sphere, he means exactly what he is saying. Let's take it a little further than that. Of course, the sphere group to which Waite belonged was headed by none other than Florence Farr. And Waite, again, referring to a sphere group, which is a most occult sphere, is specifically identifying the group which started the wheel turning. I have seen Mrs. Farr's private papers, Mrs. Emery more correctly, and the fact is, yes, she was working with spinning the Fool's 8-pointed star about. But let's go a little further here. I hope I'm not going too rapidly for you, and I realize this is somewhat astonishing, or maybe what I'm saying here today. Of course, the theme. In 1932, I'm going to jump to the other end of the line. In addition to conferences that W.B. Yeats, that is to say, was having around 1903 to 4, which I'll document with A.E. Waite on the subject of the Arthurian legend, the actual date was somewhere around mid-January of 1903. In about approximately 1918, another young gentleman of strong poetic abilities and strong theological leanings, one Charles Williams, was to pick up Waite's The Hidden Church of the Holy Grail. He went on to write what some critics regard as the best treatment of the Arthurian legend since the medieval period. However, quite apart from that, has been overlooked, he wrote a second book or novel, not overlooked, but they have never been combined, called The Greater Trumps. The fact is, everything that I'm telling you today was broken by Charles Williams back in 1932. He describes at great length the tarot dance, and he describes specifically, and I'm citing page 33 of the first edition, how there are two patterns, one of squares and one of circles, so that the eyes is with a chessboard, so now one and now the other predominant. The chessboard is specifically shown upon the Queen of Wands, whom I've already mentioned, upon the Ten of Pentacles, and upon the Pope. If you will, the Emperor, for reasons that I cannot, there's not time to do so today. We'll get to the next thing. The fact is you have got the diagram right there. It is further stated specifically in the hidden church of the Holy Grail that the Fool received a chessboard. The Knight of Wands represents the Fool. His motion is a key to the precipitate character of the rider. The entire pack moves as a series of knights moves, branching out in 4 different directions from the center, the symbol of the swastika about the poles. When Waite keeps talking about the poles moving, and when Yeats writes about the hidden pole, he means exactly that. The first public breaking of this story from a metaphysical point of view was made in France in 1925 by a man named René Guénon in a book called The King of the World, which has now been translated into English. Despite some mistranslations, I urge that the book be read. There is one important chapter called The Symbolism of the Grail, which I published separately in Studies of Comparative Religion as far back as 1966. It's been reprinted about 2 years ago. I'd hoped to do the whole book, but frankly, we couldn't interest anyone in doing an entire book on the primordial tradition at this particular point. I was very much aware as a young person that these images seemed to be in the tarot pack. But it seemed impossible. The tradition had not been broken until 1925. Wrong. The tradition had been broken in a 1,000-page book in 2 volumes, published between 1893 and 1897, with the specific aid of E. Wallace Budge of the British Museum, and later member, as I presume, of Florence Farr's Sphere Group. The book is by John O'Neill, and Waite gave the story himself. He gives it away. He goes raging against these people who are trying to give fake Egyptian origins to the tarot pack, and then remarks as if it might not be found in some strange night of the gods. Well, that's exactly where it's found. You go to the British Museum. Unfortunately, they don't have it catalogued under N. The author is John O'Neill, and I'm afraid his name is unknown to posterity. He was the friend of nearly every learned man of his time, and he had been to Japan, where he had watched Shinto dancers making their steps upon, and had been instructed by a learned Shinto priest. Later, he went to Cyprus, the home of the Templars, where he met a Sufi master who again instructed him in the dance footprints upon the sand. It is from watching these 2 ritual dances that O'Neill became convinced that there was a primordial tradition, which was based not on an east-west axis, but a north-south axis, and that the 7 originally were the 7 stars about the pole, not the 7 planets, and that in fact a whole history of mankind could be reconstituted through tracing the literal widening involuted spires coming down from the pole. It is a book which well needs to be reprinted. O'Neill writes at the end of Volume 1 that he has not had time to read James Fraser, but after his 20 years of effort, he now can settle back and read Fraser. He was dead 4 months later. There was no trouble finding a second publisher for the 2nd volume. The friends were generous. They had included, as I say, every well-known nymphonologist and sinologist of their time, E. Wallace Budge and Alfred Nutt, author of the major work on the Holy Grail. Please get these connections closely here. Financed the 2nd volume of O'Neill. It appeared in 1897. O'Neill had finished the book, Volume 1, in 1891. He says it would only take 4 months to do his 2nd volume. It appears that his editors were having much more trouble understanding what the connections between his notes were. Not improbable, as he's the only person to have ever attempted up to this point and to this day any similar lengthy exposition. I cannot recommend the reading of the work sufficiently. However, one of the people who read it was W.B. Yeats. I would put the time of the reading most specifically around 1895, but I won't bore you with technicalities today. So we have one source here. MacGregor Mathers talks a little bit about Cather being the hidden pole, but he doesn't have any of this. More specifically, it was Yeats, who was reading at the same time, who conceived the idea, and the markings are still in his library, that the primordial tradition was to be found in the ancient Welsh version of the Parsival tale. It was he who brought the story to Waite, who in fact had no use for folklore. In fact, if you read Waite's own comments of his January 1903 meeting with Yeats, he's quite put out as to why Yeats, in fact, he wants to get him out of there before he has to listen to any more Celtic folklore. But, so therefore, however, Yeats did bring Waite something very, very precise. He also brought him more than that. In 1902, December specifically, in other words, 30 days before the time of the meeting with Waite, Yeats was receiving the designs from a young lady named Pamela Coleman Smith for a play called Where There Is Nothing. Where There Is Nothing, later changed in a second version in 1907 to The Unicorn from the Stars. Where There Is Nothing. Well, that's exactly what Nancy and Henry Lee are saying in The Greater Trumps, or old Aaron Lee tells them everything depends upon the fool's position. Where there is nothing. Waite himself comes back to it in his edition of Eliphas Levy's History of Magic in 1913. The whole secret is to where the fool is located. I frankly grew up on these books and thought this was a general thing in tarot tradition. It is not. The answer, and by the way, Waite published his own answer. Oh, sorry. Waite published his own answer in the Manual of Cartomancy, back page 144, back in 1909. The answer, they could be grouped, for example, about the central figure, which is that of the quorant. But that would involve a symbolism belonging to a higher grade of the whole experiment. It's quite simple. The fool, of course, belongs in the middle. But that's assuming he doesn't move. Does he or does he not move? That's the whole point of Williams's Greater Trumps. Does everything come to him? Does he stay where he is at the center? And do we locate the center accordingly? Or does he make his knights move? Or does his alter ego, the Knight of Wands, make the move? We have quite a bit of information on this. The Yeats is always talking about the dance of his four royal persons. Does everybody here know Yeats is a vision, or how many do not? Some do not know Yeats is a vision. Well, Yeats parted with Waite for various reasons around 1912 to 13, though he wrote back to him for aid on several occasions. And I have one report, as yet unconfirmed, that Waite came down to see Yeats at Oxford in the early 1920s, though Bob Gilbert has found no corroboration at his end of the line on this. If it turns out to be true, it's going to be very significant indeed. Everybody has been assuming all of these years that Yeats went along with Falcon's magical order, whereas Waite went off on a Christian mystical order. Everyone is wrong. Yeats did not definitely attach himself to Falcon till after 1913. And in fact, attaching is a very loose word. He had the gravest reservations about Falcon. And on the other hand, Waite did not give up magic in 1901 or 1903. There is a magical ritual at the very center of the Waite-Smith, and as I claim, the Waite-Smith-Yeats pack. Let's take this a little farther now, and I'll try to explain myself. We have been told since GD times, and this much only of the original symbolism was kept. Each one of the court cards corresponds to one of the trumps major. Say, King of Wands corresponds obviously to Leo, the lion, and Waite makes a big thing. It corresponds to the symbol of the lion, and Queen of Cups corresponds to the chariot. Carrying this a little further, Knight of Swords corresponds to the lovers. And Waite goes right along with this and tells us that he is a romantic hero of prototypical chivalry. And the Queen of Cups, she has visions and she dreams, and her activity is fed by dreams. And number 4, we have the Page of Pentacles, who corresponds with the world. The Page of Pentacles is the earth of earth on the last tablet. By the way, these 4 cards are run at full length in the Waite article of December 1909. King of Wands, Queen of Cups, Knight of Swords, Page of Pentacles. The 4 royal persons who dance their dance in the sands, as O'Neill saw those Sufis dancing on Cyprus back in the 70s and 80s, long before those dancers whom his friend G.R.S. Mead wrote about in a book called Orpheus, published in 1895, which I suggest Yeats was reading simultaneously with his reading of O'Neill's Night of the Gods, probably long before Waite had read them. These figures do their dance. Yeats describes in his book of Vision, in which he comes up with his own systems later, and he draws a picture of a great wheel. And on that wheel intersect, the 4 suits of the tarot. But there is not one word about tarot in the book. However, in Yeats's private scripts, one does find that when traveling through Southern California, perhaps appropriately, in 1920, he specifically refers to himself as the King of Wands and his wife as the Queen of Cups. They are, in fact, the 2 first dancers of the 4 royal persons who make up the dance. This is not part of any other tradition except the Waite tradition. Let's carry it a little bit further. Take the Queen of Cups. She's a very good one indeed, I think, because she is on top of the chariot. And Yeats writes about that in his poem, The Circus Animals' Desertions. Lion and woman, the birdie's chariot, the whole crowd of tarot characters come on here in a poem called The Circus Animals' Desertion. My circus animals were all on show. Come now, Yeats, they weren't on show. You've never mentioned the tarot but once in your life. Nevertheless, he says they were all on show. And one finds repeatedly when one is working with the drafts, yes, they were there all along. And it was based upon the tarot geometrical arrangement. First, as a chessboard. You see how it goes now. Magician to chariot makes up the top line and represents the top world. The 8th card, whether it be justice or strength, opens the 2nd world, moves to 14 temperance. The 3rd world is, of course, the 15th card to the 21st. You put the Fool crossing the center. If you put the Fool with his red feather across justice, you have the soul being weighed in the balance. He, in fact, becomes the Egyptian Mot. When Waite says he is the Mot, he goes further and says he is the mate. He quite knows the difference between a Mot, which in French meant a dead man, or a dumbhead if you prefer with the Fool, and a mate. He is placed in the center, and he is crossed by justice on the scale. Alternatively, what card follows at this point? Please visualize the difference. The King of Wands, the leader of the dance, would previously have been in the center. He now gets moved to the 8th position, and you switch with the Queen of Swords, who now gets in the center. The Fool loses his head. When Waite thanked Pamela Coleman Smith for the several striking executions she had contributed to his pack, he meant exactly that. 20 years later, when he does his reminiscences, he still pointed out that the public hasn't adequately appreciated Pamela Coleman Smith's striking work. To go further in this, if you are unsatisfied as this being the pun, he thanks Charles Leland, the author of Aradia, the Gospel of the Witches, for his striking researches. If you check Leland's reference, or Waite's reference to Leland, you'll find it's a batch of druids with scythes waving severed heads around the page of the 1620 book on which they are represented. People have been thrown off because they do not realize that the book is about, that the pack is about severed heads. It is, they're all over the place. That pentacle, the Eight of Pentacles. You may know him, the ingenious mind turned to cunning and intrigue, the artist in stone at his work. It turns out to be, and he is displaying trophies. Look, these puns go on forever, and I've only got about 3 minutes anymore. The trophies happen to be those of Trophonius. It's all in O'Neill, and also in Pausanias, a book which Yeats as well as Waite certainly had in their libraries. Trophonius was one of the architects of Delphi, and they later decided they'd break into the treasure room and remove the materials. Unfortunately, Trophonius was stuck on the way out, and it was necessary to amputate his head. The ingenious mind turning to cunning and intrigue, displaying its trophies. Yes, those parallelograms. They show up again, by the way, in Yeats's late dance plays. In The Death of Cahulan, Emmer also dances with a severed head, which is in fact a parallelogram. And Yeats very specifically specifies what he wants in this respect. One last bit. I'll now throw in a Bacon Shakespeare claim. I can quickly give this for 2 minutes. And I was back to the Queen of Wands. Yeats's book is called A Vision. All right, the Queen of Cups sees visions and has her dreams. All right, anybody can see visions and have dreams. There's a little bit more. She feeds upon them. And does anybody remember that great, beautiful, big ciborium that gets illustrated at the front of the book? That's what she's looking into if you check your Queen of Cups. The author of A Vision is in fact looking into the Holy Grail. And to carry this a little further, let's go back to Waite now. He describes the remarkable experiences he had with psychic Pamela Coleman Smith, and how, in fact, he had to be careful that she was being spoon-fed. Many years later, Jessie Weston also brought out a book called From Ritual to Romance, which served as the basis for Eliot's The Wasteland, and his interpretation, the Waite-Smith Tarot Pack. Waite complains bitterly she was spoon-fed. The only person who could have spoon, and he further adds that the person who gave her the information was W.B. Yeats. The only person, in fact, the word spoon-fed is unusual. It's used twice in all of the Waite canon. It refers specifically to the Queen and her cup from which one feeds. It's a ciborium, but has a residue of the intinctured host. I could go on all day about tinctures, but I think you've got the idea already, and we shall close with one last bit, if my claim has been too recondite. Yes, there has to be a cipher. Waite was great on ciphers, and after all, the Fool is a ciphered card. He says that it should scarcely be necessary to enumerate them. This is his passage immediately following the Grail section. For they must be almost commonly familiar. But as it is precarious to assume anything, and as there are also other reasons, I will tabulate them briefly as follows. If you'd care to run a 23-letter anagram, I will tabulate them briefly, reads William Butler Yeats Thief. And thief is in order after you remove the William Butler Yeats. If you want to call that coincidence, I think one's carrying it a long way. Indeed. He's, of course, the magician, who's quite a good thief indeed.